Welcome to the podcast of the Public Education Foundation.
I'm Zhan Okuda-Lim with the Leadership Institute of Nevada. I'm here today with Alex Kajitani, California Teacher of the Year, faculty member with the Leadership Institute, and author of Owning It. Alex, great to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, Alex, you've been a hit with our Teacher Leader Academy, given your background, your experiences as an educator, a rapid mathematician.
That's right.
Traveling the country, working with teachers across our country. Tell us a little bit about your own background, how you got into teaching, how you got into education, and how that has led to the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I actually, right out of college, I had been trained to be a social worker. And so I got my first job as a social worker out of college, and the pay was so bad that I had to get a job at night bussing tables at a restaurant. And then in a couple hours, I'd watch these waiters make more money than I made all week doing social work. And so at that point, I was, young and started sort of moving things over. So I started going into the restaurant business as well and ended up managing the restaurant for several years. But then in my 30s, I started to kind of come to grips with what I always knew, which is that I had always wanted to be a teacher and always dreamt of being a teacher. And so at that point, I, went and got my teaching credential. And what's funny is as a teacher, I used my restaurant management skills, every single day in the classroom with everything, managing angry people and parents, to welcoming people as they walked in the door, to making them really feel like they belong there and really wanting to come back. And those were all of the things that I learned as a restaurant manager that I then began to emulate in my classroom. And so I've always, from the beginning, really tried to, as a teacher, create this culture and this atmosphere where people were excited to get to the room, wanted to be there, felt welcome, felt safe, and then left more confident and a little bit smarter than when they walked out.
And tell us how that led into your book, Owning It, where you share your reflections and tips and strategies on how teachers can take on that larger ownership over their classroom, over their school community, and playing that leadership role. Would you say that some of your restaurant hospitality experience influenced some of the ideas that you share in that book?
Absolutely, yeah. I've got one of the chapters in the book is called First Impressions, and it's really about how critical and important it is to really get people engaged right when they walk in the door and even before they walk in the door. I mean, if you think about the last time you went to a restaurant, you probably didn't just get in your car and start driving. You get in your car, start driving, and then think, oh, where do I want to go, right? Maybe you knew in advance, or you looked up some reviews in advance, or you got some recommendations. And so, the experience really starts well before you ever step in. And that's true of classrooms as well. I mean, kids talk, parents talk, kids know who their teacher's going to be, and they have, preconceived notions of what that experience is going to be like. And even from before they walk into our classrooms that very first day, I believe it's up to us as teachers to really own that and embrace that and create an experience, again, well before they even walk in, that they're gonna be excited about and be engaged, for as much time as possible.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, because when I think about your video as the rapid mathematician, you were looking at other ways to engage students, not just writing equations on the board and going through problems. Tell us a little bit more about the backstory to that.
Yeah, that's what's funny. So here I was, an accomplished, restaurant manager. Mm-hmm. I went and got all this teaching credential and my master's degree, all these fancy degrees, and I get my first teaching job, and I absolutely was sinking. I couldn't get my students to pay attention. I couldn't get them to sit still in their seats, and I certainly couldn't get them to remember, the math formulas I just taught them. But what I realized is a rap song would come out on Monday, and by Tuesday they seemed to have every single word memorized. And so I thought, okay, I need to play on this strength, right? I need to really pay attention to what it is that they're into and see if I can work that into the curriculum. And so one day we were studying adding and subtracting decimals. I went home, I wrote a rap song called The Itty Bitty Dot about the decimal point. I came in the next morning, performed it for them. If you know anything about middle school, already it was a complete disaster. My students began laughing at me hysterically. But at the end of the week, their test scores on adding and subtracting decimals shot through the roof, and they began begging for a rap song every time I introduced a new concept. And that's, when I really started to realize that one of the keys to really engaging students is to stop trying to take the curriculum and forcing it into the students' lives, and instead take the students' lives and see where it fits into the curriculum. When we go to what interests them and then work that into the curriculum, then the curriculum becomes their world, as opposed to, just this thing in a book that they're supposed to learn.
One of the chapters in your book, Owning It, is about this notion of empowering students by putting them in charge. For educators, whether they're leading a classroom or leading a department as a department chair, or even in school leadership, what does that mean to empower students by putting them in charge? And what does that look like in terms of student engagement?
Yeah, it's interesting because that chapter was inspired when I was on a leadership team that was going to kind of do a review of a school. Now, the school had, had sort of fallen victim to very low test scores and low state ratings and things like that. And so, I part of the team that they kind of sent in. And when I walked in, I was talking to one of the teachers, and she said, I don't get it. Like, we teach all day here. We have very few discipline problems. We're teaching hard all day, but our test scores just aren't reflecting that. And then as I watched classes and got to observe teachers, what I noticed is that she was absolutely right. The teachers were teaching all day long, but they were talking all day long, never giving the students an opportunity to talk and to process the information and to discuss the information. And, our students, especially today's students, they're very social, they're very collaborative. We can, sort of present the curriculum to them, but they're not going to actually internalize it and draw any deep meaning with it until they've had a chance to really talk about it with their friends, with their colleagues, with each other. And so, that is something that we see all too often. This is kind of the teacher standing at the front or doing all of the teaching and, not really giving a chance to let the teachers talk. And so one of the things that I really advocate for in my book, Owning It, are, really strategies and ways that you can kind of turn that around and really get the students to start talking, to start presenting information, to make sense of the information. I'm a math teacher. Getting students to talk about math is really hard to do, but there are some really great ways that we can do it in our classrooms, really for any subject. And it's also, there's kind of the belief or the thinking that the one doing the talking is the one doing the learning. And so it's not until we take that power and turn it over to the students, allow them to do the talking, that they really start to do the learning. The other thing I came across is, a lot of teachers are scared to turn that power to the students over because they're then scared that they're going to lose control of their classroom. And so really getting teachers to take that risk, to stop talking, to allow their students to talk, but to have the confidence and the strategies and the procedures in place that, okay, when it's time for the students to stop talking, it's okay. We're going to get back on track. We're going to have a controlled, classroom environment that's going to be well managed. And so it's scary. I get it as a teacher. It's scary to turn that power over sometimes because you're afraid of losing control.
This idea of control versus ownership, to go to the title of your book, is also in other chapters of your book, and it's also part of what you're teaching here as part of our Teacher Leader Academy. In another chapter, you talk about different ways to cultivate shared ownership of school leadership between teachers and students and administrators, right? What have you seen as you've met with educators across the country in terms of best examples or best practices of how administrators, teachers, students, families can relinquish the sense of control for this greater sense of collective ownership of the school community and the education of its students? What does that look like when it goes well?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that I really have come to believe is that the culture of a family is really formed around the dinner table, right? The conversations, the way that a family gathers for dinner, that pretty much is going to create the culture of that family. What they talk about, what they don't talk about, how interactive they are, that has a huge effect on that. What I also have come to find is that the culture of a school staff is really created at the staff meeting, right? The teachers, if they go to staff meetings and they feel engaged, if they feel empowered, if they feel like staff meetings are meaningful and, really worth their time, then that creates really a thriving school culture. If they go, oh no, it's another staff meeting, people are walking in late and we're going to sit in our little cliques and we're going to, just kind of listen to our principal. And, I love there's a kind of a social media post that I show, or meme that I show at the Teacher Leader Academy. It's a blue ribbon that says, "I survived another meeting that could have been an email." And that's how a lot of teachers are feeling across the country, where they think, "Wow, we go to all these meetings, but they just sort of talk at us, or we don't really actually ever discuss anything." And so really invigorating your staff meetings, really finding different ways to format them, to get teachers talking, and also, what gets discussed is a huge part of the culture that is then formed. The other thing I found, hands down, which I write about in Owning It, is that I can walk onto any school campus and simply by asking one single question, I can tell you almost immediately whether it is a thriving school culture or a toxic school culture. And that one question is, how do the adults on this campus deal with conflict? If there's some sort of system or form or way that adults can deal with conflict, then it's a thriving school culture almost every single time. If conflict results in, whispers walking out to the parking lot or in the back of the teacher's lounge, toxic school culture pretty much every time. And so recognizing that conflict occurs is, and then having a system to deal with it. And in Owning It, I kind of outline a simple step-by-step way that teachers, especially those who are kind of hesitant to deal with conflict or to address it, can take in order to bring the conflict to light or to solve it. And that chapter, it's funny, was actually born when I had a job as a data coach across our district. And so I'd go onto campus to, help teachers look at data and figure out what it meant and how to create lesson plans. And I'd walk onto a campus and someone would pull me aside and say, "Hey, I know you're here to talk about data, but, the teacher in room 12 isn't really getting along with the teacher in room 14, and they're on the same team, and they haven't really talked all year, and they don't really get along. Is there any way that you could work with the two of them to get them talking? Because it's really having a big, impact on our department meetings or on our grade level meetings." And so I kind of became known as this teacher conflict whisperer. And so again, it's how we talk about things, what we're doing at staff meetings that really has a huge effect on the culture, which then, of course, seeps into classroom instruction, how we're dealing with parents, pretty much everything with regards to the community.
Let's talk about where the rubber hits the road with those topics, right? So let's suppose you're visiting a school and that school is either doing professional learning community time or school-based collaboration time, SBCT, and you might see teachers walk in and you can tell it's another one of those meetings. We could have had an email to handle this, or we're just going to be lectured at for however many minutes or hours we're in this setting. What would you tell the principal? What would you tell the teachers? What would you advise them to do to make the most of that time so it doesn't continue to be another one of those eye rollers?
Yeah, absolutely. What I always do is I always recommend a very simple, very implementable change that should occur at every single meeting. Very, very simple. It's 2 simple questions. One question you ask at the beginning of every meeting and one question you ask at the end of every meeting. The first question is, and whoever is leading the meeting can ask the question or just answer the question immediately. But the first question that we should ask at every meeting is, why are we having this meeting? And we should be able to answer that question, right? And the answer shouldn't be, because the schedule says we're supposed to, right? What asking the question, why are we having this meeting, forces us as meeting attendees or as meeting leaders to do is find the purpose. Find the purpose of the meeting. Is the purpose of the meeting to look at student data and come up with, some essential questions that we want to, have our, that we want to ask at the beginning of this week's lessons? Is the purpose of the meeting to, deal with safety issues or student behavior issues or, whatever the case may be? But simply by asking, why are we having this meeting? And then answering that question, or, the meeting leader can start out with, okay, the reason we're having this meeting is, gives it the purpose and invites everybody in to understand why it is that we're there. The second question, very simple question to ask, is at the end of every meeting. And that question is, okay, so what's the plan? Everybody should be able to answer the question, okay, what's the plan? Because when everybody knows the plan moving forward, not only are they acknowledging that the meeting time was well spent, what they're also saying is, okay, I've got a deeper understanding of what it is that I need to do. We don't want to just have meetings where we sort of talk about what we're going to talk about next time or talk about things that we know should or shouldn't happen. But, the real purpose of meetings is to to discuss what's going on and then come up with a way that we can make it better, take the steps in order to inform ourselves, in order to make some improvement or to deal with whatever is at the top of our minds, things like that. So again, why are we having this meeting? And at the end, okay, so what's the plan? If you ask those two questions, you will revolutionize your meeting. I give the Alex Kajitani owning it guarantee.
And to your point, there's then that ownership over what the meeting is and over what action steps will the staff take after that meeting to implement the ideas, implement the projects, what have you, right?
Absolutely. And the other thing that I would argue is that for a principal, a staff meeting is probably the biggest opportunity to show, I guess, external leadership, right? To show that they are passionate about the school, to show that they are, a leader who is in control, who is thoughtful, who is authentic. And so when a principal gets up, or a vice principal, or any leader gets up, at the staff meeting and talks about whatever they need to talk about, or ask whatever questions they need to ask, that is a prime opportunity to be a leader, to be seen as a leader, and to ask questions as a leader. And so, staff meetings are also a leadership opportunity for those who consider themselves in leadership positions. And of course, as leadership is really not so much a position as it is a decision. Mm-hmm. And so that decision to lead effectively in staff meetings is really a great opportunity.
You also mentioned the implications of conflict and how a school community, the educators, those who are part of that community handle conflict, deal with conflict, right? What's your advice to teachers who might be encountering conflict either between themselves and colleagues or with others, students, families, or even teachers who notice that among others in the school community? How can individual educators take some ownership and take it upon themselves to improve that aspect of school climate if they identify this sort of toxic culture of conflict in the school community? Yeah,
so what I've noticed is, or what I know is that teachers especially, but pretty much everybody is at a different, sort of developmental level with conflict and how they want to deal with conflict, whether they even want to deal with conflict, right? So for teachers, for example, who know that there's an issue, know that there's a conflict, something that they want to deal with or something that they want to address, but, are terrified of conflict, have, no idea where to even start. I always recommend Susan Scott's book, Fierce Conversations. It is hands down the best book I've ever read about why it's important to bring it up, how to even get started, and sort of real implementable strategies that you can use. So that's a great one to just kind of start with. Then, of course, there are teachers who aren't afraid of conflict. They're not shy about getting in the middle and speaking their mind, but they don't necessarily have the skills in order to really address it from a compassionate point of view. And so what I always recommend for those teachers is, just a kind of a series of steps, and they're all outlined in Owning It, but really to to kind of condense them, the first thing that you really want to do is you don't want to just kind of, let's say you need to address a specific colleague about a conflict that's happening, right? You don't want to just burst in and talk to them, but you want to give them a little bit of lead time, I call it. And so, stopping by and saying, hey, I'd really like to talk to you about something. Are you available right now? Or do you have a minute? Or would it be okay if I, came after school? Things like that. And just kind of giving the person that you're talking to an opportunity to take a breath and not feel like they're blindsided by this conflict or by whatever it is you're going to say. And then the other thing is, when it comes time to actually say what you need to say, I always recommend that people, do a little bit of rehearsing, right? Whatever is going to come out of your mouth, you don't want that to be the very first time you say it. Just kind of think and rehearse a few times out loud by yourself or whatever it is you're going to say. And then when you are addressing that conflict, really being as specific as possible, and and really separating someone's behavior from their self-worth. So, for example, saying to somebody, let's say you have a colleague who is consistently late to your department meetings, right? Saying to somebody, hey, I noticed that you were 15 minutes late to our meeting this week, and last week you were 17 minutes late. Is everything okay? That's a whole lot different than walking in and saying, hey, you're always late to meetings. What's going on? Or I need you there on time, right? But really going in, from a compassionate viewpoint, really seeking to understand first, but not being shy about saying, hey, we really need you there on time because we've got a lot to discuss, and your opinion is very valuable. The other thing that's important to remember is there are always different levels of conflict, right? So, for example, I get called into there's what we call the internal, the external, and the philosophical, right? So let's say, like, I get called in to work with a lot of teachers who are struggling in classroom management. I could go in, and so that's their external conflict. They're struggling in classroom management. But then there's this internal conflict. They're sitting there at night thinking, gosh, do I have what it takes to survive, to be a teacher? Like, are they going to fire me at the end of the school year? Are my colleagues talking about me, saying how out of control my classroom is? Right? That's their internal conflict. And then there's this philosophical conflict, which is, how do we create safe learning environments for all of our students so that they can learn? So often we go in with the external, hey, I know you're not doing well in classroom management. I'm here to help you. When really we need to go in with more of that internal or more of that external, like, hey, how are you feeling about teaching right now? Or, one of the things I really want to do is make sure that all of the students on our campus can learn and that they can learn in a safe environment. And so let's talk about how you can provide that in your classroom. Again, there's the external, the internal, the philosophical, and really taking the time and thinking about it from as many viewpoints as possible is going to help when you finally walk in to deal with whatever conflict has arisen.
And I think that's an important point that's applicable to so many things, whether it's individual classrooms, running a school district, looking at state level policy. It's that idea of looking at as many different viewpoints as possible, understanding where different stakeholders are coming from, what they might be experiencing, and then using that knowledge of what you see from different viewpoints, what you hear from different stakeholders to then identify where's the best place to make a change. Hey, Alex, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us on our podcast. We really do appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. I love coming to Teacher Leadership Academy. Like you said, this is my 5th year here, and it's some of the best work I do all year and my most favorite work. And it's a real pleasure.
Thank you.